Hi there. Before we begin, take a deep breath. Maybe dim the lights a little. Let the room cool down and just settle into your space. If you've got a fan nearby, go ahead and turn it on. This video isn't just something to watch, it's something to feel, something to drift into. Tonight, we're traveling back nearly 2,000 years to a side of ancient Rome most history books ignore. The private, often painful daily life of a Roman prostitute. Now before we continue, do me a little favor. Just drop a comment with your city or country, and let me know what time you're watching. I love seeing where you're tuning in from. Someone in Lagos at midnight, someone else in Amsterdam making toast, or someone winding down in Manila. It reminds us all that no matter how far apart we are, we're taking this journey together. And if you enjoy slow, thoughtful history, the kind that peels back layers and reveals the forgotten lives, go ahead and like this video and subscribe to the channel. We're just getting started. You might be wondering why this topic. Why focus on prostitutes in ancient Rome? The answer is simple. Their lives, though marginalized, tell us more about power, survival, and society than most emperors ever could. They lived at the edges of the Roman world, yet they were everywhere, in taverns, in alleys, in brothels, even in the shadows of temples. Their stories weren't carved into marble or written into epic poems, but they existed, and they mattered. And tonight, we're going to try, just for a while, to imagine what it was like to wake up in their shoes. You wake up in the dark, the kind of dark that feels thick, like you could reach out and touch it. There's no window, no soft morning light, just the quiet sound of someone shifting on straw nearby, and the sharp, sour scent of wine and sweat still lingering in the air. Your back aches. You slept on a pile of old straw that's half flat and itchy, laid across cold stone. Fleas bit you during the night, and there's a rough wool blanket bunched up near your feet. It's not enough to keep you warm, but it's all you've got. Above you, the wooden beams creak slightly. Maybe there's someone walking overhead, starting their own day, or ending it. You sit up, careful not to knock your head against the low ceiling. The room is more like a closet, barely big enough to stretch your legs. A cracked mirror leans against the wall. Next to it, there's a comb with missing teeth, a little pot of rouge that's almost empty, and a thin bronze bracelet. These are your things, all of them. This is where you live, and where you work. In a brothel like this, or maybe it's a corner of a tavern, privacy doesn't really exist. A thin curtain or a wooden plank separates your space from the next girl's. Sometimes you hear her crying in the night, sometimes you cry too. But no one talks about it. The bucket in the corner smells like it needs to be emptied. You'll have to carry it out later, through the narrow hallway, past the walls where clients once scratched crude messages, names, prices, insults, jokes. The air back there always smells of smoke and damp stone. You haven't even stepped outside yet, but already you're tired. This is not a palace. It's not the glamorous Rome of statues and senators. It's the underside, the broom closet of the empire. But this little room with its fleas and faded perfume is your world. And it's where your story begins. You don't live here because you want to. You live here because you have nowhere else to go. The room you call home is barely that. A narrow, windowless space carved out at the back of a brothel or squeezed into the cellar of a noisy tavern. There's no sunlight, no breeze, just 4 stone walls damp with the smell of old water and stale breath. The straw mattress on the floor is lumpy and sour. It's never clean. You've shaken it out before, but the fleas always come back. The straw crackles when you move, and sometimes it clings to your skin like your own sweat. There's no bed frame, no pillow, no sheets, just straw and cold stone beneath your back. You might place your wool shawl under your head, folded, pretending it's a cushion, but it never really helps. You have a few things. Not much, but enough to remind yourself that you are still a person. A small bronze mirror, scratched and dull. A comb with 2 missing teeth. A half-used pot of red powder for your cheeks. You've kept these carefully. They're lined up along the floor where the wall meets the dirt. You don't own much, but these small objects make the difference between waking up as a tool and waking up as a woman. There's no plumbing here, no pipe to bring clean water. In the corner of the room sits the bucket, the one you hope no one knocks over. When it's full, the smell grows sharp and unbearable. You empty it daily, but still, the stench settles into your clothes, into your skin. It lingers in your nostrils even when you step outside. Privacy? There's none. The walls don't really divide anything. Maybe a thin piece of wood or a dirty curtain hangs between you and the girl next door. You hear everything, every sob, every whisper, every tired breath. Some nights, when the noises come through the wall, not cries, but other sounds, you try not to listen, but there's no escaping it. The room is too small to hide from other people's lives. Sometimes, if you stretch your hand out too far, you'll accidentally knock against her wall, if you can call it that. Just a bit of split timber nailed into place. And the door? It's not really a door. More like a board you push aside when someone comes in, or when they leave. This isn't a home built for comfort. It's a space designed for use. You sleep here. You work here. You cry here. You recover here. All in the same square of dirt and dust. Outside your room, the hallway curves around in dim, uneven steps. You share this path with a dozen other women, each with her own little box of stone. When someone opens the main door above, a thin slice of daylight trickles in, just enough to remind you what you're missing. It disappears as quickly as it comes. In this world, there's no place to hide, from the noise, from the men, or from yourself. But you make it work, because you must, because this is what's left. And somehow, in this crowded, creaking cellar, you still manage to breathe. The morning doesn't really start with sunrise. In a room like this, there's no window to let the light in. Instead, it starts with a sound. Footsteps overhead, voices in the hallway, maybe someone groaning as they roll off the straw. You sit up slowly, sore from sleep, and take a deep breath. The air is thick with old wine, sweat, and something sharp like vinegar. It clings to your hair, to your clothes, to everything. The first task is always cleaning. You grab the short-handled broom and sweep the dust back into the corners. The floor is never really clean, just less filthy. There's a wine stain near your bedding from a client who knocked over his cup. You scrub at it with a damp cloth, but the smell stays. The straw on your mattress is scattered from the night before. You fluff it out the best you can, picking out anything that doesn't belong. Bits of dried leaves, a strip of torn cloth, a broken piece of bracelet that fell off in the dark. You shake your blanket by the door, watching a puff of dust rise into the air, then hang it back over the edge of the bed. Once your little room is somewhat in order, it's time to take care of yourself. You can't bathe here. There's no water, no basin, no privacy. So you gather your things into a small cloth bundle, a comb, a rag, a tiny pot of rouge, and whatever coins you've managed to keep. You push aside the door and step into the hall. Out on the street, Rome is already waking up. Bakers are firing their ovens, slaves are running errands, and shopkeepers are sweeping their thresholds. You walk quickly, head down, toward the nearest public fountain. It's not far, maybe 5 or 6 minutes, but even that short walk gathers dust on your feet. At the fountain, you splash cold water on your face and neck. You rinse out your cloth and scrub behind your ears, under your arms. If you're lucky, the water flows clear and steady. If not, you wait your turn and try not to breathe in the smell of so many unwashed bodies. Sometimes, if you've earned enough, you visit the public baths. It's crowded and loud, but there you can soak in warm water, rub your skin with strigils, and breathe something other than cellar air. You buy a pinch of natron, the chalky white powder used as soap, and scrub your arms and legs until they sting. A bath costs money, though, and for women like you, even a single denarius is a luxury. Most days, the fountain is all you can afford. After washing, you find a quiet corner to reassemble your appearance. You smooth down your hair with wet fingers and comb it flat. If you have a wig, especially a blonde one, you dust it off and pin it carefully in place. Roman men like blondes. Something about it feels foreign, exotic. Next, the rouge. You dab it on your cheeks to hide the hollowness. It's not much, just a touch of color, but it helps. Some women add a line of charcoal around their eyes or use a bit of lead paste to whiten their skin. You avoid the dangerous stuff if you can, But beauty always has a cost. Finally, the perfume. It's cheap, and you've stretched the last few drops for weeks. Still, a dab behind the ears, a little on the wrists, and you don't smell like the night anymore. You smell like something softer, something more sellable. You pass other girls on your way back. Some of them look fresher, some look worse. You nod, exchange a glance, but rarely speak. Everyone is tired. Everyone is trying to look like they're not. Back in your room, you hang your cloth on a nail and sit quietly for a moment. Your hair is in place. Your face is powdered. You smell faintly of roses and ashes. The day hasn't even truly begun, but already you've scrubbed and scraped and painted yourself into someone new. That's what it takes. In a world where beauty is currency, where a clean neck or a bright cheek can mean the difference between coins and hunger, your morning isn't about comfort. It's about transformation. And every day, you start from nothing, trying to look like more than you feel. Clothing in ancient Rome wasn't just fabric, it was a message. And for you, it's one you cannot afford to get wrong. The moment you step outside, every thread you wear tells people who you are, what you do, where you belong. Respectable Roman women wore stolas, long flowing garments of muted colors that signaled modesty, family, and dignity. But you wear the toga. It might surprise someone today, but the toga wasn't always a man's garment. In fact, women could wear it too, but only certain women. The female toga was the mark of someone outside society's moral walls: adulteresses, divorced women, and prostitutes, especially prostitutes. It was loud, meant to be seen, meant to stand out. Made from thinner fabric, sometimes bleached too brightly or dyed with cheap garish colors, yellow, purple, red. It clung to the body in ways a matron's stola never would. There was nothing subtle about it. You pull yours on carefully. It's not new. The edges are frayed. One corner has a stain you've never been able to remove, no matter how many times you rinsed it at the fountain. But when it's draped just right, it still catches attention. And that's the point. In a city bursting with distraction, temples, markets, slaves, statues, noise, you need to be visible. The toga does that. It screams what your lips don't. Along with the toga, there are other parts of the uniform. The jewelry, for example. You can't afford gold, not real gold, but the cheap stuff sparkles well enough. A tin bracelet here, a bronze ring there, nothing valuable, but it adds flash. Sometimes you rub oil on them to make them shine. A client, if he's drunk or eager, won't know the difference. Your sandals are worn thin at the soles. The leather straps leave marks on your ankles where they rub raw, but going barefoot isn't an option. Sandals elevate you just enough off the grime of the street, enough to keep your feet presentable. And when you walk, they make a faint sound that some clients claim they can hear coming down the alley. It's part of the effect. Then there's your hair. Roman beauty standards lean toward blonde, the color of the Germanic slaves, the exotic north, the unattainable. You're not blonde. Few Roman women are. But wigs exist. You keep yours on a small stand near your bed, stuffed with cloth to keep the shape. It's made of coarse hair, stiff in places, but still pale enough to catch the eye. You secure it with pins, brush it gently, and make sure it sits just right. A crooked wig draws the wrong kind of attention, or worse, no attention at all. Together, all of it creates your image. Not just your body, but your brand. You're not just a woman anymore, you're a signal, a product, a walking advertisement. Your clothing isn't about comfort. Far from it. It's tight, scratchy, too hot in summer, too cold in winter. But it works. It draws glances. And that might be the difference between earning a few coins and going hungry. There are rules too. Roman laws made it very clear who could wear what. Prostitutes weren't just expected to dress this way. In some cases, they were required to. The female toga was like a legal stamp, a way for the city to mark who was respectable and who wasn't. And even if no law was read aloud to you, society enforces it with its stares, its whispers, its laughter. Respectable women cross the street to avoid brushing shoulders with you. They clutch their stolas tighter, lift their chins higher. You don't speak to them. You don't look them in the eye. Even if you were once one of them, even if you came from a house like theirs, once you wear the toga, there's no going back. But the irony is, all this effort, the rouge, the wig, the jewelry, the bright dress, it's not just for men, it's for the world. Because if you don't look the part, if you don't play the role convincingly, then you're not just ignored, you're invisible. And in your world, invisibility is more dangerous than shame. So you check your reflection once more. You straighten the folds. You pat your hair down. And you step out onto the street not just as a person, but as a message. You're here. You're available. And in a city that sees everything, yet remembers so little, you're trying not to disappear. Rome was noisy. Always. There were shouts from fruit sellers, haggling in the markets, the creak of carts on stone roads, clatter from blacksmiths, prayers echoing from temples. In that chaos, standing out wasn't easy. But if you wanted to survive as a prostitute, you had to be noticed. Marketing wasn't optional, it was survival. And every girl had her own way of doing it. Location was everything. Some worked in brothels near the Subura, the rougher part of town, where soldiers and drunks stumbled through at night. Others picked spots near the bathhouses. Those were prime real estate. Men came out clean, refreshed, relaxed, and often in the mood for a bit more comfort. So you learned to time it right. Wait outside the public baths in the late afternoon. Smile just enough. Lean against the wall like you had nowhere better to be. Then there were the temples. Sacred places, yes, but not always so holy in practice. Freelancers, especially those not attached to brothels, often loitered near the temple of Venus or Mercury. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. Near the gods of love and commerce, these women made quiet deals in shadows. You'd see them on steps, pretending to pray, or maybe lighting incense. But really, they were watching, waiting for someone to meet their eyes. Taverns were another hotspot. If you had charm and a thick skin, working inside a tavern could double your chances. Serve wine, flirt a little, get familiar with the regulars. You might pour a drink with one hand and let your other rest just a little too long on a customer's shoulder. It wasn't subtle. It didn't need to be. The goal was to plant the idea. And if you weren't lucky enough to be in a fixed location, you walked. Slowly, deliberately, through alleys and side streets, past bakeries, past busy squares. You made yourself visible. Some girls called out directly to men, teasing, inviting. Others just made eye contact, then looked away. Let them follow. Let them wonder. Let them choose. But the real secret, the ancient trick to reputation, was in the walls. Roman graffiti wasn't just political slogans or poetry, it was advertising. Crude carvings in stone, names, symbols, messages scratched into plaster with bits of charcoal or metal. Some brothels had full menus etched outside. Others just had names like Marcia, skilled and friendly. Or short reviews, left behind by clients like drunk critics. Tertia's the best, worth every coin. It was Rome's version of Yelp, and it mattered. A good review might bring in new clients. A bad one? It could follow you for weeks. Some women tried to carve over the insults, scribble out names, write something nicer above it. Others just moved on, found a new corner, reinvented themselves. Marketing wasn't just about attraction, it was damage control too. Clothing helped, bright togas, flashy jewelry, all of it made you visible. But it also helped to have a look. Some girls were known for their hair, others for a scent. Strong perfume that lingered after they passed. A few adopted little tricks, a crooked smile, a certain laugh, something clients would remember, something to make you stick in their minds after the coin was gone. Networking was another skill. You got to know the gatekeepers, the doormen, the bath attendants, the tavern owners. Slip them a little coin or a favor, and they'd whisper your name to someone looking. You want someone soft-spoken? Try the girl down the alley with the yellow scarf. It was subtle, but effective. Word of mouth kept you working. Even the city's geography shaped the trade. Narrow streets meant you could lean from a doorway and be right beside traffic. In the wide-open plazas, You needed to move more, use gestures, take up space. The marble steps of theaters or public fountains gave you a place to perch and be seen. Rome offered no billboards, no business cards. Your body, your clothes, your voice, that was your brand. You learned to read people fast. Who had money? Who didn't? Who was dangerous? Who was drunk? Who'd pay up front and who would run? Every evening was a gamble, but a calculated one. You had to be smart, not just pretty, clever, not just loud. Some days no one noticed. Some days you walked for hours and came home with nothing. But then a soldier would smile. A merchant would wink. Someone would whisper your name like they remembered, and you'd know your strategy was working. Because in a city of 1,000,000 souls, fading into the background meant you were already halfway gone. Marketing wasn't decoration. It was your anchor. It was how you stayed afloat. In ancient Rome, selling your body wasn't just about desire. It was a business. But like all businesses, it had layers. There were bargains and luxuries, bottom shelves and top tiers. And where you landed on that invisible ladder often depended on things beyond your control. Your age, your looks, your status, and most of all, whether you were free or enslaved. For the women who worked the streets, those standing near taverns or pacing the alleys of the Subura, the price was painfully low. 1 or 2 asses, not animals, coins. An ass was a small bronze piece, worth so little that a loaf of bread might cost the same. These women worked for coins that jingled loud but stacked small. It meant multiple clients just to eat, sometimes more than a dozen in a night. And even then, barely enough for food, rent, or to buy a new pair of worn-out sandals. For every client, the same routine. A quick agreement, a dim corner, a few coins exchanged. Maybe the man left satisfied, maybe not. But either way, the coins clinked in your hand. Or, if you were enslaved, they never did. Because many of the women weren't free. They were owned, sold into brothels by desperate families, captured in war, or born into slavery. They didn't get to keep what they earned. Every coin went to the leno, the pimp or madam, who controlled their time, their space, their body. They were assets, not people. Some tried to save scraps, hiding coins under floorboards or in cracks in the wall, hoping one day they might buy their freedom. But that took years, sometimes decades, and most never got there. Then there were the meretrices, the registered, often free high-end prostitutes. These women operated differently. They had clients from the upper classes, senators, merchants, foreign dignitaries passing through. Their prices were higher, measured in denarii, not asses. A denarius was a silver coin, worth much more, maybe 10 or 20 times more. A single session could bring in what a street girl made in a week. But even then, the income wasn't all theirs. Free prostitutes still had expenses: rent, clothes, perfume, bribes to the bath attendants or doormen to recommend them. Some hired assistants or paid off officials to avoid harassment. And if they worked under someone, a landlord, a madam, a tavern keeper, there was always a cut taken off the top. Negotiation played a role too. Some girls haggled, while others set firm prices, and some, especially the desperate, let clients name their price, not out of choice, but survival. Because when your stomach is empty and your rent is overdue, pride gets quiet. The market had seasons too. During festivals or military parades, business boomed. Soldiers returned home with pockets full of coin and hearts full of fire. But in winter or during times of famine, even the wealthier clients stayed away. You learned to save in the good weeks if you could. Most couldn't. Tips were rare, affection was rarer, and no matter how much you earned, there was always someone else, younger, newer, cheaper, just around the corner. Competition never slept, neither did bills. So, whether you earned a few asses or a handful of silver, the reality was the same. It was never quite enough. Not for freedom, not for safety, not for peace of mind. The city took what it could from you and left you to chase what little was left. Imagine walking through a cramped stone corridor, the air damp and heavy, with walls that whisper stories in faded red paint. This is the lupanar, not just any brothel, but the one in Pompeii, preserved by ash and time. It's not luxurious. It's a maze of cold stone and small doorways, each leading to a space barely big enough for a single person to lie down. If you're picturing silk sheets and romance, forget it. These rooms were carved out like niches in a wall, built for speed, not comfort. The beds were made of stone. Yes, stone. Sometimes with a thin mattress thrown on top if you were lucky. Otherwise, just a cloth or fur to soften the slab. The walls around each bed were sometimes decorated with frescoes, painted images of people mid-act, not for art, but for advertising. It was both menu and instruction manual, showing clients what was on offer and what to expect. And alongside the pictures, scratched into the plaster by past visitors were words, names, prices, boasts, insults, crude jokes. Graffiti that now reads like a dusty review board, ancient Rome's version of Yelp. The term lupanar itself is loaded with meaning. It comes from lupa, the Latin word for she-wolf, slang for prostitute. So a lupanar was literally a place of she-wolves. It's a word soaked in judgment, painting these women as wild, animalistic, untamed. It was never meant to flatter, but it became a kind of twisted badge of identity, a label slapped on both the building and the women inside it. Inside, privacy was minimal. Each room, if you could call it that, was separated by a curtain, maybe a wooden door if it hadn't rotted or been stolen. The ceilings were low, the hallways narrow. In the back, there might be a small courtyard for air, or a water jar for basic washing, but the smell of sweat, wine, and bodily fluids was everywhere. These spaces weren't hidden from society. They were built into the very bones of the city, just a few steps from bakeries, homes, and shops. Everyone knew where the lupanars were. They were part of the neighborhood. The lupanar in Pompeii, the best preserved example we have, had 10 small rooms and vivid wall paintings still visible today. It shows how transactional, how public, and how ordinary this part of life was. You weren't entering a private bedroom. You were entering a business, a space optimized for volume, not intimacy. Managing all of this was the Leno or Lena, the pimp or madam. They didn't just own the brothel, they managed the schedule, set the prices, and controlled the women's lives. In many cases, they also owned the women, especially if the women were enslaved. The Leno handled the payments, doled out the meager food, and decided who worked which room and when. They might have had an office or lived upstairs watching over everything. Some Lenons were brutal, others were businesslike, but none were soft. Clients came and went, some regulars, some strangers. A few brought wine or gifts, but most brought just enough coins for the act. They would enter, point to a painting or whisper what they wanted, and then walk down the hallway toward a curtain and a face, tired, painted, waiting. After a few minutes, they'd leave again, often carving something into the wall before stepping out. A name, a rating, a memory, sometimes vulgar, sometimes oddly poetic, and in the middle of it all, the woman, or girl, who had to pretend she didn't see it, who had to be someone's fantasy, even as she faded from her own. The lupanar wasn't a place of passion. It was a machine, a blunt tool of survival for some, profit for others, and momentary escape for those who paid. But it was also strangely normalized. In Rome, these places weren't seen as scandalous. They were accepted, regulated, taxed, like bathhouses or markets, just part of the city's rhythm. And yet, despite how ordinary they were also marked by silence. No one bragged about working in one. The walls did the talking. And over time, those voices, scratched in haste, painted in bold, became the only record of lives most never cared to remember. Today, we walk through the ruins and read their words. We trace the paintings and imagine the faces. And for a moment, in those tight stone corridors, we remember them. Not just as lupa, not just as part of the lupanar, but as people who lived, endured, and left their stories behind in whispers on the walls. Not every woman in Rome's sex trade worked from a lupanar. In fact, many preferred the unpredictability of the streets or the dim, smoky corners of a tavern. Each path came with its own kind of freedom and its own set of dangers. Picture a small tavern on a Roman side street. Oil lamps flicker against the cracked walls, casting yellow shadows on stained stone floors. The air smells of wine, garlic, sweat, and old smoke. Laughter rises and falls like waves, sometimes warm, sometimes sharp-edged. You're not here just to serve drinks. You're here to sell attention, smiles, conversation, and, if the moment's right, something more. Working in a tavern meant multitasking. You'd pour cheap wine into chipped cups, clean up spills, flirt with customers, and signal availability with a glance, a wink, or the touch of a hand. There wasn't a fixed room, no stone bed or curtain to retreat behind. Instead, deals were whispered over the bar or made under the table. Sometimes you followed a client outside to a side alley or upstairs to a back room, if the tavern had one. Sometimes it happened right there in a shadowy booth, barely hidden by a hanging cloth. Unlike in a lupanar, you weren't under a pimp's complete control, at least not always. Many tavern workers were still enslaved or managed by someone, but some had more autonomy. You could set your own prices, pick your clients, and even walk away if something didn't feel right. That kind of freedom was rare, and it came with a cost. Taverns could be chaotic, fights broke out, drunks grew aggressive. And while many regulars respected the tavern girls, there were always those who didn't. You might smile at a man one moment and have to dodge a slap the next. Bouncers or barkeeps might help if they liked you. If not, you were on your own. Freelancers, those who worked the streets or public spaces, lived by instinct. You might start your day outside a bathhouse, hoping to catch men on their way out, clean and in the mood to spend. Or wander near the market, weaving through stalls of figs and olives, looking for familiar faces or promising new ones. Temples and festivals were also common spots, where the line between sacred and profane blurred easily. A whispered invitation, a subtle gesture, was all it took. Some freelancers had regular clients, others relied on charm and luck. Most had to keep moving, because Roman law wasn't on their side. Magistrates patrolled the streets, and freelance sex work could land you in serious trouble, especially if you weren't officially registered, or if you stepped too close to a space reserved for respectable women. A few coins could smooth things over with the right official, but not always. There were also rules about where you could stand, how you dressed, and what hours you could work. Break them, and you might end up fined, branded, or worse. Still, many women chose this life because it meant no rent to a pimp, no curfew, no being locked in a cellar with a dozen others. It meant risk, but also the tiniest bit of control. And in Rome, control was rare currency. Taverns and streets weren't just workplaces, they were ecosystems, alive with noise, gossip, opportunity, and danger. A good tavern girl knew the rhythms of her crowd. She knew when to push, when to flirt, when to walk away. A savvy freelancer knew the streets like maps, where the shadows fell at different times of day, where the magistrates turned blind eyes, where soldiers spent their evenings. Some women bounced between both worlds, a day serving wine in the tavern, a night on the street, or a few hours freelancing during festivals, then back to the safety of a familiar booth. You did what you had to do. There was no perfect formula, just survival, one customer, one coin, one careful choice at a time. The brothels might have been official, regulated, structured. But out here, in the noise of taverns and the unpredictability of the street, this was where the real hustle happened. Not safer, not easier, but for some it was worth the gamble. Because for a few hours, they weren't just workers. They were performers, traders, players in Rome's oldest economy, writing their own terms, even if only briefly, in the spaces between shadows and smiles. In ancient Rome, even the business of the body wasn't free from the reach of the empire. Sex work, though frowned upon socially, was fully absorbed into the Roman economic system, regulated, taxed, and tracked. If you worked as a prostitute, you weren't just a body in a room or a shadow on the street. You were, in the eyes of the state, a taxable asset. The Roman government imposed a specific tax on prostitutes called the vectigal ex capturis. This wasn't some under-the-table bribe or local fee. It was an official, state-imposed income tax on sexual labor. Collected by publicani, or tax contractors, it was part of the broader Roman system of privatized tax farming. These publicani didn't always have a reputation for fairness. They were paid based on what they collected, so they were motivated to push hard, sometimes too hard, to squeeze every coin from workers already living on thin margins. To ensure the tax was properly enforced, prostitutes, both free and enslaved, were required to register with local magistrates called aediles. These officials were responsible for a variety of public duties, including maintaining order in markets, overseeing public games, and regulating moral behavior. They also kept track of registered sex workers. Registration meant more than just writing your name down. It labeled you, permanently, as a meretrix, or prostitute. For free women, this label came with heavy social consequences. Even if you left the trade, the legal stigma remained. You were classified as infames, meaning you lost many of your civil rights. You couldn't testify in court. You couldn't marry a senator. Your word carried less weight, even outside the brothel. For enslaved workers, things could be even harsher. Many were physically branded by their owners or by the state. The mark, sometimes just letters like PM, prostitute of the market, might be burned into the skin of the arm or thigh. This branding wasn't just for control. It was a public sign of status, a mark that followed you everywhere. There was no hiding from the law. If you were caught working without being registered, or if your tax hadn't been paid, you could be fined, imprisoned, or worse. Some women were stripped and beaten in public. Others lost their place in the brothel entirely, replaced by someone younger, cheaper, or more compliant. But it wasn't all about punishment. For the state, it was business. Sex work was a consistent, reliable stream of revenue. It brought money into the public treasury. It supported a whole ecosystem of tavern owners, cloth sellers, perfumers, and doctors. And like everything in Rome, once money was involved, regulation followed. Despite the harshness, this system created a strange kind of legitimacy. You weren't respectable, but you were legal. That legal recognition offered minimal protection, but it was better than nothing. It meant aediles might look the other way if someone assaulted you, because you paid taxes. It meant you had a place in the order of things, even if it was low on the ladder. In a way, the Roman prostitute was both marginalized and essential, pushed to the edges of society, yet woven into its structure, branded, taxed, tracked, and still standing, still. In Rome, everyone seemed to have an opinion about prostitutes, and most of them weren't kind. Senators, priests, noblewomen, and moral philosophers all had something to say. They preached decency, modesty, and discipline. They warned that prostitutes were a threat to family values and social order. They condemned them in speeches, in law, and in literature. But when the sun went down, those same men, and sometimes even the women, didn't always live by their own words. Public morality in Rome was layered with contradiction. The same senator who passed laws regulating brothels might have had a favorite girl in the subura. The same priest who denounced lust might slip into a tavern's back room after dark. Roman matrons would scorn prostitutes for corrupting their husbands, but look the other way when those same husbands went out to clear their heads. It was a society that needed prostitutes, but also needed to pretend it didn't. Writers like Juvenal captured this hypocrisy with biting sarcasm. In his satires, he mocked both the women who sold pleasure and the men who bought it. He didn't hold back. One moment he'd rail against the immorality of sex workers, and the next, he'd make fun of the pompous husbands who secretly relied on them. His words weren't gentle. They were cruel, judgmental, and full of scorn. But they reflected a society deeply conflicted about desire, control, and appearances. The laws were no better. Roman aediles enforced codes of conduct for prostitutes, regulating what they could wear, where they could stand, how they could advertise. But those same officials were known to be corrupt, often taking bribes or looking the other way. It was a legal system that punished prostitutes for being visible while profiting from their existence. You had to register, pay taxes, maybe even be branded, but still, you were shamed for doing what the law permitted. Gender played a huge role in all of this. A man who visited prostitutes wasn't necessarily judged. In fact, some considered it a normal part of male behavior. But the women involved, especially if they were freeborn, were labeled infames, stripped of their dignity and social standing. It was a double standard baked into the culture. Men's desires were excused, women's bodies were blamed. And so Roman prostitutes lived with constant judgment, not just from the elites, but from neighbors, strangers, even their own families if they were known. They were necessary and hated, tolerated and shunned, legal and despised. They served Rome in the shadows, and Rome pretended not to see. But the city would not have functioned the same without them. That's the uncomfortable truth at the heart of the empire's moral facade. Working as a prostitute in ancient Rome wasn't just physically exhausting or socially isolating, it was dangerous. Every day brought new risks, not only from violent clients or angry pimps, but from the silent threats no one could see: disease, infection, and the heavy toll of stress that built up over time. Venereal diseases were a constant hazard. The Romans didn't have any real understanding of bacteria or viruses, so there was no way to prevent or treat infections like syphilis or gonorrhea. If you caught something, you lived with it, or died from it. Treatments often involved herbs, wine rinses, or ointments made from honey and vinegar, but none of it truly cured anything. Some girls tried to self-medicate with local remedies, hoping the burning would go away on its own. Most of the time it didn't. Pregnancy was another terrifying possibility. Without modern contraceptives, prostitutes relied on the few tools available, many of them unreliable or dangerous. Silphium, a plant once famous across the Roman world, was widely used as a contraceptive and even an abortifacient. But by the 1st century, it had already been harvested into extinction. Other options included wool tampons soaked in herbal mixtures, amulets for protection, or rituals whispered by other girls in the brothel. These methods were more about hope than science. When pregnancy happened, it changed everything. Enslaved women had no say in what happened next. Their child could be sold, or simply left to die. Free women might attempt abortions, risking their lives with sharp objects or poison. And if the baby was born, there was no guarantee it would survive. Poverty, malnutrition, and lack of basic medical care meant infant mortality was heartbreakingly common. Infections weren't limited to sexually transmitted ones. A minor cut, if left untreated, could turn deadly. Many brothels were dirty, full of fleas, stale wine, and mildew. Stone beds scratched your skin. Public bathhouses helped a little, but even they weren't clean by today's standards. A scraped knee could fester. A bad tooth could become an abscess. Pain was a normal part of life. But the worst wounds were often the invisible ones. The emotional toll of the work, the constant judgment, the sense of being disposable, it left scars. Many prostitutes coped by leaning on each other. Friendships formed in the shadows of shared beds and whispered jokes. They gave each other tips, offered a shoulder when things got rough, and sometimes just sat quietly together when words were too heavy. In a world that didn't offer safety, these bonds were their shield. Some tried to dull their pain with wine or herbs. Others hardened over time, building walls that nothing could break. And a few didn't make it through. Suicide, though rarely recorded, did happen. It's easy to imagine a girl who had lost everything, her health, her family, her hope, slipping away into silence. Despite all of this, they endured. Not because they were immune to suffering, but because they didn't have a choice. There was no doctor waiting with antibiotics, no therapist to talk to, just another day, another client, another night on a straw mattress. In a world that barely acknowledged their existence, Roman prostitutes survived the only way they could, by pushing through pain, clinging to small comforts, and carrying each other through the worst of it. In a life where safety was never guaranteed, and tomorrow was always uncertain. Many Roman prostitutes turned to something older, deeper, and invisible, the world of gods, spirits, and superstition. Religion wasn't just ceremony or tradition for them. It was survival. It gave structure to chaos and a thread of control in a life where most decisions were made by someone else. The goddess Venus, the divine embodiment of love, sex, and beauty, held a special place in the hearts of many women in the trade. Offerings to her were common, small tokens like flowers, perfumes, or even a portion of their earnings left at shrines in alleyways or near bathhouses. Sometimes they whispered prayers before meeting a client, asking for protection or for a kind man instead of a cruel one. Venus wasn't just a symbol of love. She was a shield, a listener, a presence in the background when no one else cared. Fortuna was another favorite, the goddess of luck, of chance, of fate. In a world where so much relied on chance, the right client, the right moment, the right escape, Fortuna became an anchor. Her temples often welcomed those who didn't fit neatly into Roman society. Prostitutes left coins at her altars, hoping for a better tomorrow or the smallest shift in fortune. Even a single good day could feel like a miracle. Beyond the grand temples and marble statues, there were the more private rituals, charms worn around the neck or tucked beneath pillows, incense burned before sleep, secret prayers said into the palm of a hand. These acts didn't need approval from priests or temples. They came from a personal space, a quiet plea for safety or revenge or love. And then there were the curse tablets, defixiones. These were thin sheets of lead inscribed with requests, curses, or commands, then folded and nailed into the walls of tombs or dropped into sacred springs. Some asked for help in beating a rival, maybe a girl who stole clients or spread rumors. Others pleaded for a lover to return, or a cruel man to suffer the pain he inflicted. These weren't just superstition, they were action, power, voice, in a world that rarely allowed these women any of those things. Superstition filled the gaps where logic failed. A dream might be a message. A crow at the window might be a warning. The way a coin landed could decide whether to accept a dangerous client. In many ways, these beliefs weren't irrational. They were adaptive. When your world gives you no control, creating patterns and meaning helps you survive. Religion didn't erase the pain, but it gave comfort. It made these women feel seen, if not by society, then by the gods. And in a life where so many looked away, even that small feeling of being watched over, of being known, meant everything. Love, in the world of a Roman prostitute, was rarely simple. Most of the time it wasn't even real. Many clients spoke sweetly, called them beautiful, whispered promises, pretended affection. Some came back again and again, not just for the body, but for the feeling of being seen, comforted, listened to. And in return, the women gave them something that went beyond touch. They gave warmth, attention, even moments of tenderness. But deep down, they knew. These men would walk away, back to their wives or their homes, while the women stayed behind, alone in their cramped rooms, waiting for the next visitor. That kind of emotional labor, pretending to care, sometimes even wanting to care, was exhausting. It wasn't just physical work. It was acting. It was shielding your heart while offering your smile. And sometimes, boundaries got blurry. A kind client, a familiar face, a man who gave a gift instead of just coins. The heart wanted to believe in something softer, but reality always returned. They weren't allowed to dream beyond what they were. Roman law was clear. Prostitutes were considered infames, a legal category that stripped them of certain rights, including the right to marry respectable Roman men. Even if love were real, it couldn't go anywhere. A soldier, a senator, even a merchant. None could legally or socially take a prostitute as a wife. Any such union would be seen as shameful, degrading, or simply invalid. The law didn't just regulate their bodies, it boxed in their futures. So instead they turned to each other. Among the other women in the brothel or tavern, they found a different kind of love, friendship, solidarity, protection. They shared food, laughed at clients behind closed curtains, comforted each other after rough nights. Sometimes they pooled money to help a sick friend. Sometimes they just sat together in silence, letting the quiet be enough. These bonds weren't recorded in Roman history, but they were real, maybe even more real than any client's passing affection. There are traces of these relationships, messages scratched into brothel walls, small inscriptions on cheap jewelry, even references in Roman poetry. And though their names are mostly lost to time, the emotions behind them remain visible if we look closely enough. In a world that offered them so little kindness, the tenderness they shared with each other was revolutionary. So no, they didn't get the romantic stories carved into stone, but in hidden corners of Rome, behind curtains and inside cramped rooms, love still lived, messy, quiet, real. Not always between lovers, but between survivors. And that, in its own way, was just as powerful. In ancient Rome, aging wasn't kind to most people, and it was especially unforgiving to women who had spent their youth in the shadows of brothels and taverns. A prostitute's beauty was her currency, and once age began to blur the edges of that youth, survival meant adaptation. Wrinkles, gray hair, slower steps, these weren't just signs of age, they were signs that the work was changing, whether one liked it or not. But retirement, in the way we imagine it today, didn't exist for them. There were no pensions, no savings accounts, no quiet homes by the countryside. For many, continuing to work in some form was the only way forward. Some simply kept doing what they had always done, but with a new angle, lowering their prices, shifting to older or poorer clientele, or moving to less competitive areas. Others embraced a more theatrical touch, leaning into the role of the experienced woman, someone who could still offer warmth, stories, or a sense of familiarity. For those who could no longer physically or emotionally manage the work, there was still a place in the trade. As a madam, these women, often seasoned and sharp, ran the brothels or oversaw younger prostitutes. They kept track of clients, managed payments, settled disputes, and offered guidance. In many ways, they were both businesswomen and caretakers, sometimes feared, sometimes respected. Being a madam didn't mean luxury, but it did offer a bit more control, a little more distance from the front lines. Others took up fortune-telling, dream interpretation, or selling love spells, trades that still involved performance and emotional reading, but didn't require the same physical toll. Superstition was widespread in Rome, and a former prostitute, with her world-worn gaze and mysterious air, could pass easily as someone with access to hidden knowledge. For some, this shift wasn't just practical. It was a way to reclaim power, to reshape their story. Still, aging came with judgment. Roman society valued youth and beauty, especially in women. An older prostitute could be mocked, dismissed, or pitied. The same men who once paid for their time might now sneer at them in the street. Yet even in the face of all that, the physical wear, the societal scorn, the fading of attention, the simple fact of enduring was its own kind of victory. To grow old in that world was no small thing. It meant you had navigated danger, disease, heartbreak, and poverty, and somehow, you were still standing. Whether behind a curtain, at a street corner, or in the back room of a tavern reading palms, these women carried on. Quietly, cleverly, unnoticed by the poets and the politicians, but no less real. And in their survival, there was a kind of strength that no one could take away. When we look at the grand stories of ancient Rome, the triumphs of generals, the speeches of senators, the marble statues of emperors, there's very little mention of the women who worked in its shadows. Roman prostitutes, despite being everywhere in the daily life of the city, were mostly left out of noble histories and official records. Their lives weren't celebrated, their voices weren't preserved in scrolls, and their names rarely appeared outside court cases or slurs. They were, in many ways, deliberately erased from the polished image Rome wanted to present to the world. But that doesn't mean they were invisible. You can still find traces of them if you know where to look. In Pompeii, for example, walls are still covered in graffiti that name individual women, quote their prices, describe their specialties, or even rate their performance. Crude, yes, but also a strange kind of preservation. These scribbles, written by clients and workers alike, show that these women had reputations, marketing tactics, and sometimes even fans. In a way, they were running personal brands before the concept even existed. Legal records also hold fragments of their stories. Some women took their clients or brothel owners to court for unpaid dues or unfair treatment. These records, dry as they may seem, show that prostitutes were not just victims. They were people who used the legal system when they could, demanded fairness when possible, and navigated a society stacked against them with surprising boldness. In Roman poetry, especially the satirical kind, prostitutes appear again and again, sometimes mocked, sometimes envied, often objectified, but undeniably present. Writers like Marshall and Juvenal couldn't ignore them because they were too much a part of the urban fabric. These women weren't living in the margins. They were the city's rhythm. They knew how to sell, how to read people, how to survive. And that's perhaps their most overlooked legacy: survival through skill. In a brutal world, they understood the market. They adapted. They learned how to turn what little they had, their voice, their clothes, their stories, into currency. They managed clients, negotiated prices, watched out for competitors, and even trained newcomers. In modern terms, they were entrepreneurs, resourceful, strategic, and often more in tune with the economics of the street than the men in togas claiming to rule it all. Their legacy isn't carved in marble or sung in epic poems, but it's real. It's in the cracked walls of ancient brothels, in faded graffiti, in the small items recovered from the dust, mirrors, pins, makeup pots. It's in the quiet acknowledgement that Rome didn't run on marble alone, but on the backs of its most overlooked citizens. By remembering them now, we're not just filling in the gaps, we're challenging the story itself. Because history isn't just about the powerful, it's also about those who endured, unseen. And Roman prostitutes, despite everything, did exactly that. Now, as we leave the stone alleys of Rome behind, let's sail north, across time and sea, into the misty lands of the Norse. The cold air bites a little sharper here, and the forests stretch endlessly into the horizon. Among these pine-covered hills and snowy fields lived people who fought harsh winters, sailed dangerous seas, and placed deep trust in the hidden powers of nature. And in every village, tucked between longhouses and animal pens, lived a figure both feared and respected: the Viking healer, known as a lechner. Unlike Roman prostitutes, who were often scorned despite being part of everyday life, Viking healers held a position of quiet reverence. They were not warriors, but they were essential to survival. These were the men and women called upon when fevers struck, when wounds festered, or when a child's breath grew weak in the night. They understood the rhythms of the body and the unseen forces that moved beneath it. Their craft was a blend of hands-on experience and inherited wisdom, passed through generations not in books, but in whispers, rituals, and careful observation. The Lechner worked with roots, leaves, and bark, knowing just which plant soothed pain or stopped bleeding. But healing wasn't just about herbs. It also meant appeasing the spirits, reading signs from the gods, or chanting charms to protect the soul while the body mended. This dual path, the earthly and the spiritual, made Viking medicine feel both deeply personal and profoundly mystical. In a world where life was often short and uncertain, these healers offered not only remedies, but reassurance. They reminded their communities that illness wasn't just a failure of flesh. It could be a message, a curse, or a test. And only someone who understood both the earth and the old gods could guide the sick back toward balance. Imagine a Viking warrior, wounded in battle, his arm gashed and bleeding. The healer doesn't panic. She reaches into her pouch and pulls out a handful of finely crushed yarrow. With practiced fingers, she presses it into the wound, whispering a quiet invocation to Odin as the bleeding slows. This isn't just medicine. It's ritual. It's memory. It's power passed down from the ancestors. Yarrow, known to the Norse as a sacred healing plant, was one of the most important herbs in a Viking healer's kit. It grows wild in the meadows and along the fjords, with delicate white flowers and feathery leaves. But beneath its gentle appearance lies a tough, potent remedy. Vikings used yarrow to stop bleeding, fight infection, and cool fevers. Its astringent properties made it ideal for dressing wounds, especially those from swords, axes, or the jagged edges of long-distance travel. But yarrow wasn't just about the body. It held a deep spiritual role too. When a healer applied it, especially during war or illness, they might speak charms invoking Odin, the all-seeing god of war and wisdom. Odin himself was said to have given knowledge of healing herbs to humanity, and calling his name during treatment helped connect the injured to the divine. Yarrow's use became a form of spiritual protection, as well as physical care, guarding the soul while mending the flesh. Archaeological digs in Scandinavia have even found traces of yarrow pollen in burial sites, suggesting it was valued not only in life, but also in death. Perhaps it was placed with the dead to ease their journey into the next world, or to honor the healer's touch one last time. Its presence speaks to how deeply this little flower was woven into the Viking world, from battlefield to hearth, from body to belief. In the end, yarrow was more than just a battlefield herb. It was a symbol of balance between strength and care, between warrior and healer, and between this world and the next. In the cool northern landscapes where the Vikings lived, there was a tall, graceful plant with hollow stalks and umbrella-shaped flowers, Angelica. Its scent was sharp, almost musky, and its presence was more than botanical. For Viking healers, Angelica was a sacred gift from the gods, known not just for its healing power, but also for its deep spiritual meaning. It was medicine for the body and the soul. When someone came down with a fever, a cough that rattled deep in their chest, or a mysterious swelling, the healer might reach for Angelica root. Boiled into a bitter tea or chewed raw, it was used to clear respiratory issues and fight infection. Women, too, often received Angelica treatments for regulating menstrual flow, easing cramps, or managing childbirth pain. It was a versatile ally, growing even in harsh climates, and always ready when other herbs had withered away. But healing wasn't just about removing illness, it was about restoring balance. Viking healers understood sickness as something that could be spiritual just as much as physical. That's why Angelica was also burned during purification rituals. Its smoke was believed to cleanse the space of harmful spirits or negative energy, especially during times of illness, death, or childbirth. Sometimes, a healer would circle the smoke around a patient's body or the doorway of a longhouse, whispering prayers for protection and strength. Angelica's power was also tied to its presence in stories and customs. It was said to repel evil, ward off plague, and protect against poison. Some even wore small pouches of dried Angelica root around their neck or tucked into clothing, like a charm. Others planted it near doorways or burial sites, where its presence symbolized purity and strength even in the face of darkness. To the Viking healer, Angelica wasn't just an herb, it was a symbol of life's persistence. It grew where others wouldn't. It fought what others couldn't. And in a world full of danger and cold and uncertainty, that kind of strength wasn't just useful. It was sacred. As the last snow melted and the rivers began to swell with fresh runoff, Viking healers turned their attention to one of the first signs of spring, the birch tree. Slim, pale, and quietly powerful, the birch stood as a symbol of new life. And deep inside its trunk, the tree carried something precious: sap. Thin and slightly sweet, birch sap wasn't just a drink. It was a medicine, a ritual, and a sign of renewal. Each spring, healers or household members would carefully tap the trunks of birch trees, collecting the clear liquid in wooden bowls or horn cups. Timing mattered. The sap only flowed for a short window, just as the tree woke from winter dormancy. Miss it, and you'd have to wait another year. Birch sap was used to restore energy after the long dark winter. People drank it to recover from months of poor diet, illness, and fatigue. It was light, refreshing, and believed to cleanse the blood, a natural detox before the busy farming and raiding seasons began. Healers would sometimes mix it with cooling herbs like meadowsweet or mint to help bring down fever or reduce inflammation in the body. It could also be slightly fermented into a mild tonic, giving it both preservation and a little extra vigor. Beyond its physical uses, birch sap carried strong symbolism. It was life flowing again after a season of stillness. In some places, it was offered in small rituals as a thank you to the earth, a way of recognizing the tree's gift and the beginning of the year's healing cycle. Young warriors or sick elders might be given the first cup as a gesture of strength returning to the body. Even the tree itself was considered sacred by many. Birchwood was used for cradles, symbols of birth and purity, and its bark, bright, smooth, and always peeling, reminded the Norse people of renewal and transformation. To drink from the birch was to drink from the world's resilience. In the hands of a Viking healer, birch sap wasn't just nourishment, it was a reminder, no matter how hard the winter, spring would come, and with it, strength. Juniper was more than just a sharp-scented shrub to the Vikings. It was a plant of power, used to cleanse the body, protect the home, and purify the spirit. Whether burned as smoke or brewed as tea, juniper had a special place in the healer's collection, prized for both its physical and spiritual properties. The small bluish berries of the juniper plant were used to make medicinal teas. These teas worked as a natural diuretic, helping the body flush out excess water, waste, and infection. People suffering from bloating, urinary problems, or general sluggishness were often given juniper to wake up the system. Its antiseptic qualities also made it useful for treating minor wounds and infections, both inside and out. A healer might crush juniper berries into a poultice or oil and apply it to irritated skin or swollen joints. But beyond its medical uses, juniper held a deep spiritual value. When dried branches were burned, they gave off a strong resinous smoke that filled a room with a sharp, woody aroma. This smoke was believed to chase away evil spirits, disease, and even bad luck. Healers used it to sweep spaces clean, especially before births, healing sessions, or after someone had died. Homes were fumigated with juniper smoke to remove lingering illness and spiritual heaviness. In steam baths, an important part of Norse hygiene and healing, bundles of juniper were sometimes tossed onto hot stones. As the branches sizzled, they released their cleansing aroma into the rising steam. Bathers would breathe in the vapors, believing they were not just cleaning their skin, but also clearing their thoughts and lifting their spirits. Juniper also served a protective role. Branches were hung near doorways or tucked into bedding to guard against misfortune. Travelers might carry a small pouch of juniper berries, believing the plant would shield them from harm. To Viking healers, juniper wasn't just a treatment, it was a full-body, full-spirit cleanse. Whether brewed, burned, or bathed in, this humble shrub played a powerful role in keeping both the physical and invisible forces of life in balance. Meadowsweet was one of the Viking healers' most trusted plants, not because it looked impressive, but because it worked, gently, consistently, and in many ways. It was used to treat pain, reduce swelling, and ease troubled digestion, making it a kind of all-purpose remedy in the healer's bag. Long before anyone knew what aspirin was, they were already relying on meadowsweet for many of the same reasons. The plant itself grows tall and feathery, with creamy white flowers that give off a sweet almond-like scent. But its power comes from its chemistry. Meadowsweet contains salicylic acid, a compound very similar to the active ingredient in modern aspirin. When brewed into a tea or crushed into a paste, it helped to soothe headaches, sore muscles, and joint pain. For people with arthritis or recovering from battle wounds, meadowsweet offered relief without the harshness of stronger herbs. It also helped with digestive issues. If someone complained of bloating, heartburn, or cramps, a warm infusion of meadowsweet was often the first thing a healer would offer. Its calming effect on the stomach made it useful for children and elders alike, especially after heavy or poorly cooked meals, which weren't uncommon in Viking times. Culturally, meadowsweet was also tied to peace and comfort. Its soft scent made it a favorite for drying and storing inside longhouses. Dried blossoms were scattered on the floors during gatherings or tucked into pillows to promote rest and pleasant dreams. For many people, the smell of meadowsweet was the smell of safety, of being home, cared for, and pain-free. Unlike some herbs that came with strong warnings or tricky preparations, meadowsweet was considered gentle. That didn't mean it lacked power, but rather that it could be used often and with less risk. This reliability made it a staple for Viking healers, not a flashy cure, but one you could trust. In a world where pain relief was limited and medical help hard to find, meadowsweet filled a quiet but essential role. Whether brewed as tea after a long day, spread over sore limbs, or simply smelled to lift the spirit, it reminded people that healing didn't always need to be harsh. Sometimes, it could be soft, sweet, and steady. Mugwort was more than just a healing herb to Viking communities. It was a plant woven deeply into both the physical and spiritual parts of life. Known for its earthy smell and silvery green leaves, mugwort had a strong reputation for helping with digestion, calming menstrual cramps, and easing the body during times of stress or sickness. But its real power, according to Norse traditions, reached far beyond the physical body. Healers often used mugwort to help with stomach problems after meals or during illness. A warm infusion made from its leaves could calm indigestion, relieve bloating, and help with nausea. It was also one of the few herbs trusted to ease menstrual pain, making it especially important to women who had limited options for relief. Its calming effects extended to the nerves as well, offering gentle support to people dealing with tension or sleeplessness. But mugwort's reputation wasn't just based on what it could do for the body. Spiritually, it was considered one of the most powerful plants in the healer's kit. It was burned during rituals for cleansing and protection, especially in homes where illness, misfortune, or bad dreams had taken hold. The smoke of burning mugwort was believed to chase away evil spirits and protect against dark energies. One of the most sacred uses of mugwort was in cider rituals, the Norse spiritual practice of prophecy, trance work, and connecting with unseen forces. Practitioners, often women known as vulvas, would burn mugwort or place it beneath their pillows to invite visions or dreams. It was believed to open the mind, sharpen intuition, and guide the soul through spiritual journeys. In this way, mugwort served not only as a medicine, but as a bridge between the physical world and the unseen. Mugwort was also used in charms and amulets, sometimes braided into wreaths or worn near the skin, to ward off bad luck or illness. In burial rites, it may have been laid with the dead to protect them on their journey to the afterlife. For Viking healers, mugwort wasn't just another plant. It was a trusted ally, one that healed the gut, calmed the womb, and opened the door to visions. Its presence in both everyday healing and sacred rituals made it one of the most valued herbs in the Norse world, blending earth and spirit into a single leaf. In the Viking world, garlic was seen as both a powerful medicine and a shield against unseen forces. Though it likely arrived through trade routes from the south, once garlic entered the Norse healer's toolkit, it became a trusted cure for a variety of ailments and a symbolic defense against evil. Medicinally, garlic was valued for its strong, pungent oils, which could fight off infections and cleanse the body. When crushed or boiled, garlic released compounds that worked against bacteria and parasites. Viking healers used it to treat wounds, soothe inflamed skin, and help those suffering from fevers or digestive troubles. For intestinal worms and stomach ailments, garlic was either eaten raw or mixed into herbal brews. It was especially helpful during times of poor food storage or contamination, when parasites and sickness were common. Garlic's ability to cleanse and protect made it more than just a remedy. It became a kind of herbal armor. In Norse homes, cloves of garlic might be hung near doorways or woven into bundles with other herbs to keep out illness and malevolent spirits. Healers sometimes rubbed garlic on the skin or wrapped it in cloth to wear around the neck, not only for its medicinal scent, but for its power to ward off misfortune. Its smell, while strong and sharp, was part of its strength. People believed that evil forces avoided it, unable to bear its pungency. In this way, garlic was much like iron or fire, a tool used to mark safe boundaries between the living and the spirit world. Because garlic was not native to Scandinavia, its presence in Viking settlements points to the trade networks that brought goods from faraway lands. Healers who used garlic were not only skilled in medicine, but also connected to a broader world of knowledge and exchange. A single clove carried the wisdom of distant lands, preserved and adapted for the cold, damp north. So whether boiled in a healing broth, pressed into a wound, or hung in the rafters for protection, garlic was a staple in Viking healing. It cleansed the body, guarded the soul, and reminded everyone who used it that even the smallest root could hold great power. Among the Vikings, nettle was more than a weed. It was a symbol of resilience, a plant that stung but also healed. It grew wild across the northern landscapes, thriving in poor soil and harsh weather. Its tenacity mirrored the Viking spirit, and healers recognized its value not only for health, but for everyday survival. Medicinally, nettle was a powerhouse. It was used as a general tonic, something to build strength, especially after illness or long winters. Healers gathered its leaves in spring, when the plant was most potent, and boiled them into teas or soups to restore energy, improve blood circulation, and support overall vitality. Nettle's high iron content made it especially useful for those suffering from fatigue, paleness, or blood loss. Joint pain, often worsened by cold climates and physical labor, was another target of nettle therapy. In a practice known as urtication, fresh nettles were deliberately brushed against the skin. The stinging hairs caused a controlled irritation that increased blood flow to sore areas. Though painful, this method brought relief, easing the stiffness of arthritis or old injuries. It was a raw, honest approach, using pain to fight pain, and it worked well enough to remain part of folk medicine for centuries. But nettle's usefulness didn't stop at healing. The Vikings also used it in material culture. Once dried and retted, nettle stalks yielded fibers that could be spun into thread. While not as soft as flax or wool, nettle fabric was sturdy and practical. It was used for fishing nets, cords, and rough garments, things that needed to last. In this way, nettle became a bridge between the healer's hut and the weaver's loom. Its dual role, soothing the body and clothing it, made nettle a valued plant in Norse life. It offered nourishment, strength, and warmth. And because it often grew where other plants would not, it became a quiet emblem of endurance. So when a Viking healer reached for nettle, they weren't just choosing a remedy. They were calling on the power of persistence, drawing strength from a plant that knew how to sting and how to survive. Viking herbal medicine was never written in books or carved in stone. It lived in the minds and hands of healers, passed from one generation to the next through quiet instruction, practice, and memory. Mothers taught daughters, elders guided apprentices. Each herb's look, smell, use, and sacred story was remembered through everyday life, woven into chants, rituals, and seasonal routines. It was an oral tradition, deeply tied to the land and the rhythms of survival. But as Christianity spread across the Norse world, much of this tradition began to fade. Pagan practices, especially those involving magic, cider, or offerings to old gods, were pushed aside or condemned. Healers, once respected, were sometimes labeled as witches or outcasts. Sacred herbs were demystified or forgotten, and healing shifted toward Christian saints, relics, and monastery-based medicine. Still, not everything was lost. Some knowledge stayed alive in rural communities, quietly practiced under different names. And in recent decades, scholars and herbalists have begun to recover parts of that wisdom, studying archaeological finds, Norse sagas, and folk traditions that preserved echoes of Viking herbalism. Today, many of the herbs once used by Viking healers, yarrow, angelica, birch, nettle, mugwort, are still used in modern herbal medicine. Their benefits are now understood in scientific terms, but their roots remain in something older, deeper. A healing system that saw the body and spirit as one, that honored plants not just as remedies, but as allies. So while the Viking healers may be gone, their legacy lives on, in gardens, in apothecaries, and in the quiet resilience of the herbs they once knew so well. Joan of Arc was born in 1412, in a small village called Domremy, tucked away in the northeastern corner of France. The village was quiet, with green fields, grazing cattle, and narrow dirt paths. Joan's family were peasants. Her father, Jacques, was a tenant farmer, and her mother, Isabel, raised the children and ran the household. Life was simple, harsh, and deeply rooted in the rhythms of the land. Days were filled with chores, prayers, and the kind of close-knit routines that shaped most peasant lives. But Joan's world wasn't peaceful. She grew up during one of the most violent and unstable periods in French history, the 100 Years' War, a long and bitter struggle between England and France over who had the right to rule. By the time Joan was a child, large parts of northern France were under English control. The countryside was full of danger, roaming armies, raiders, burned fields, and shifting allegiances. News of sieges, betrayals, and battles would have reached even small villages like Domremy, carried by travelers or whispered in churchyards. Joan would have been taught to fear war, to stay away from soldiers, and to pray for peace. The church was the center of village life. Joan's family were devout Catholics, and from an early age, she stood out for her deep piety. She prayed often, attended Mass regularly, and was known in Domremy as a good, obedient girl. There are accounts that she was unusually serious for her age, drawn to religious stories and the lives of saints. She believed in angels, in heaven and hell, and in the idea that God had a purpose for each soul, even hers. Though she couldn't read or write, Joan absorbed the world through sermons, stained glass windows, and the spoken stories passed down by elders and priests. Her world may have been small, but her faith was huge, and in a time of violence and confusion, it gave her a sense of stability, and eventually, a sense of mission. Joan's early years were marked by a contradiction. A quiet, rural life lived under the constant threat of war. From this unlikely soil, a girl would grow who would change the course of French history, not by sword alone, but by sheer belief in something bigger than herself. When Joan was around 13 years old, something extraordinary happened, something that would shape the rest of her life and ultimately define her place in history. According to her own testimony years later, it was in the garden of her father's home, around midday, when she first heard a voice. It wasn't just a thought or a feeling. It was, to her, unmistakably real. She described it as coming from God, filled with light and accompanied by a deep sense of awe and peace. Soon these voices were joined by visions. She later identified them as Saint Michael the Archangel, Saint Catherine of Alexandria, and Saint Margaret. These were powerful figures in medieval Catholic belief. Saint Michael was the warrior of heaven, Saint Catherine was a brilliant martyr who had defied pagan scholars, and Saint Margaret symbolized purity and strength in the face of torture. For a devout peasant girl like Joan, these were no ordinary saints. They were heavenly heroes, and they had a message for her. They told her she had been chosen. France was suffering, its people oppressed, its king disinherited, its future uncertain. But God, through these saints, had called Joan to act. Her mission was clear. She was to help drive out the English, bring peace to the land, and make sure Charles, the rightful heir, was crowned King of France. In the medieval Christian world, visions were not uncommon, especially among mystics, monks, and deeply religious women. The church saw these experiences with a mix of reverence and suspicion. But for Joan, they were not just private spiritual moments. They were commands. She believed with her whole being that these voices came from heaven, and she was prepared to follow them no matter the cost. What's remarkable is how persistent and detailed the voices became. They told her what she must do, where she must go, and gave her strength when she doubted. When she was later put on trial, these visions would become central to her defense. She never denied them. In fact, she insisted on their truth, even under threat of death. For Joan, these divine messages were more than inspiration. They were orders. She didn't seek greatness or glory. She sought obedience to a calling she believed came directly from God. And from this belief, unshakable and unwavering, her journey truly began. After receiving what she believed were divine instructions, Joan didn't act recklessly or rush into battle. Instead, she tried first to convince local authorities. At just 16 or 17 years old, she approached Robert de Baudricourt, the captain of the garrison in Vaucouleurs. She told him plainly that she had been sent by God to save France, and that she must be allowed to speak with the Dauphin, Charles, the uncrowned heir to the French throne. Unsurprisingly, Baudricourt laughed her off. He saw a poor peasant girl, claiming divine voices and demanding to travel across war-torn France to meet a prince. But Joan didn't give up. She returned again and again, convincing locals of her sincerity and even winning the support of a few soldiers. Eventually, after months of persistence, Baudricourt agreed to send her to the court at Chinon. The journey was dangerous, nearly 300 miles through enemy territory, cold weather, and roads often prowled by bandits or English patrols. To protect herself, Joan cut her hair short and dressed in men's clothing: boots, tunic, and hose. This cross-dressing wasn't meant to deceive, but to survive. In her time, women traveling alone or dressed as men were often punished or ridiculed, but Joan insisted it was for safety and necessity. Later, this choice would be used against her in her trial, but at the time, it helped her reach her destination alive. She arrived at Chinon in March 1429. The court of the Dauphin Charles was skeptical. By then, Charles had heard many claims from prophets, mystics, and visionaries, all promising salvation for France. He agreed to test Joan. According to chroniclers, he switched places with one of his courtiers and hid himself among his retinue. Joan, however, walked straight to him and identified him without hesitation. How she did it is still debated. Perhaps she had seen him before or had help, or perhaps she truly was guided by something beyond explanation. In her own account, she claimed divine insight. What stood out most was Joan's unwavering confidence. She didn't speak like a deluded peasant or a madwoman. She spoke with calm conviction, declaring that she would lift the siege of Orleans and lead Charles to Reims, where he would be crowned king. The court was intrigued, if not fully convinced. Charles, unsure but desperate, decided to send her to theologians for examination. This journey, from a rural village to the grand halls of a prince, wasn't just physical, it was symbolic. A teenage girl, poor and untrained, had forced her way into the heart of France's political crisis. Her faith, courage, and insistence had broken through the skepticism of men in power. Whether they believed her visions or not, they couldn't ignore her presence. Joan of Arc had entered history, and she wasn't leaving quietly. By the spring of 1429, the city of Orleans had been under siege for nearly 7 months. It was one of the last major strongholds loyal to the Dauphin Charles, and its fall would have opened the path for the English to advance deep into the Loire Valley, and perhaps crush the remaining resistance. Morale was low, supplies were running out, and many believed it was only a matter of time before the city would surrender. That's when Joan of Arc arrived, wearing white armor and riding a white horse. She was just 17. Though she had no formal military training, she carried a banner instead of a sword and claimed that she had been sent by God to save France. And to the people of Orleans, she looked like hope made flesh. Joan's presence electrified the defenders. Her confidence, faith, and refusal to accept defeat gave new energy to weary soldiers and commanders. Though she didn't command troops in a traditional sense, issuing orders and planning maneuvers, she served as a spiritual leader and rallying point. The commanders, who had been cautious for months, suddenly found themselves emboldened to act. She urged direct action, and within days of her arrival, the French forces began attacking English positions. Joan was always near the front lines, carrying her banner high. On May 7th, during an assault on one of the English fortifications, the heavily defended Les Tourelles, Joan was struck by an arrow between the neck and shoulder. For a moment, it seemed like she might be lost. But she returned to the battlefield later that same day, wounded but unbroken, urging the troops forward. That night the French captured the fort. The next morning the English, shocked and demoralized, lifted the siege and retreated. Orléans was saved. The victory wasn't just military, it was deeply symbolic. A city that had been on the brink of collapse was now free. A teenage girl, previously dismissed as a delusional peasant, had become the face of resistance. Her success proved that she wasn't just a curious oddity or temporary inspiration. She was a force to be reckoned with. For the French, it felt like a miracle. For the English, a nightmare. For Joan, it was the beginning of something bigger. The fulfillment of her divine mission was now within reach. She had promised she would save France, and with Orléans she had taken the first major step. After the miraculous lifting of the siege of Orléans, Joan's focus turned to the next phase of what she believed was her divine mission, to see Charles VII crowned King of France. But there was a problem. The traditional coronation site, Reims Cathedral, lay deep in territory still controlled by the English and their allies, the Burgundians. To reach it, Joan and Charles would need to march through hostile land, facing the risk of ambush or battle at every step. Despite these dangers, Joan was unwavering. She insisted that God's will demanded it. And so, in June 1429, Charles agreed to the journey. What followed was a slow but determined procession through the heart of France. Along the way, towns and fortresses that had once refused to recognize Charles began opening their gates. Some surrendered peacefully, others fell after brief skirmishes. But the message was clear. The tide was turning. Joan's presence was instrumental. She rode at the head of the column, her white banner catching the wind. To many who watched her pass, she was more than just a girl or even a soldier. She had become a living symbol of divine favor, national hope, and spiritual renewal. On July 17, 1429, Charles was finally crowned at Reims Cathedral. The ceremony followed ancient traditions. Charles was anointed with holy oil from the sacred ampulla, a symbol of divine right. Bishops, nobles, and soldiers crowded the cathedral, and standing close to the new king, banner in hand and tears in her eyes, was Joan of Arc. Later, when asked why her banner had been present during the coronation, Joan simply replied that it had shared in the labor, so it should share in the glory. The coronation was more than a ritual. It was a powerful political and religious act that legitimized Charles in the eyes of the French people. No longer just the Dauphin, he was now the anointed king, a king crowned with heaven's blessing, if Joan was to be believed. For Joan, this moment marked the fulfillment of the promise her visions had given her. She had led Charles to Reims. She had seen him crowned. Her mission, as she understood it, was complete. But history was not yet finished with her. After the triumphant coronation at Reims, Joan was eager to press on and reclaim more of France, especially Paris. To her, capturing the capital was the logical next step. It would not only deal a blow to the Anglo-Burgundian alliance, but also cement Charles VII's authority. Joan believed that with God's help and the people's support, Paris could be taken just as Orléans had been. But politics were changing. With Charles now crowned, many of his advisors urged caution. They favored diplomacy over further war. Some even hoped to negotiate peace with the Burgundians, who still held Paris. Joan, however, was impatient. She saw hesitation as a lack of faith, or worse, betrayal of France's divine destiny. Despite internal disagreements, Charles allowed Joan to lead an assault on Paris in early September 1429. It was poorly timed. The city's defenses were strong, its walls thick, and its garrison well prepared. Joan, ever fearless, led her troops from the front, rallying them with her usual fervor. But the battle was brutal. Arrows rained down from the ramparts, and defenders held their ground. As she approached the city's gates, Joan was struck by a crossbow bolt in the thigh. Badly wounded, she refused to retreat until she was carried away by her men. For hours, she had tried to inspire them, bleeding, shouting encouragement, even as the assault faltered. But Charles, still hesitant and listening to cautious advisors, refused to send reinforcements. Eventually, the attack was called off. Joan was devastated. This wasn't just a military failure. It was a spiritual one. She had believed Paris would fall just as surely as Reims had opened its doors. Instead, the loss marked the beginning of a shift in power. Her influence over Charles began to fade. The court grew distant. Her victories were remembered, but her voice no longer carried the same weight. For Joan, Paris became a bitter turning point, a reminder that even divine fire could be cooled by politics. In the spring of 1430, Joan found herself once again on the front lines, this time near the northern town of Compiègne. Though her influence at court had diminished, she hadn't abandoned the fight. The town was under threat from Burgundian forces loyal to the English, and Joan rushed to its defense. Her sense of duty, both spiritual and patriotic, hadn't wavered. On May 23rd, during a skirmish outside the city walls, Joan led a sortie against the enemy. At first, her forces held their own, but soon the tide turned. The Burgundians counterattacked with overwhelming numbers, and Joan's group was pushed back toward the gates of Compiègne. As she and her men retreated, the city's defenders made a fateful decision. They closed the gates. Whether the closing was a deliberate betrayal or simply panic remains debated, but the result was the same. Joan was left outside the walls, surrounded. She was pulled from her horse and taken prisoner by the Burgundians. The girl who had once turned the tide of a war was now at the mercy of political enemies. Joan's capture sent shockwaves through France. She was a symbol, not just of victory, but of divine justice. Now she was in the hands of those who had every reason to silence her. The Burgundians, motivated more by political gain than justice, quickly arranged her sale to the English for a hefty sum. They saw her not only as a dangerous enemy, but as a propaganda tool, proof that her visions were false, her mission delusional. By summer's end, Joan had gone from battlefield commander to prisoner in enemy hands. Her trial was now inevitable, and behind it stood not only English power but French betrayal, the price of politics in a fractured kingdom. Joan of Arc's trial began in January 1431, in the city of Rouen, then under English control. She was only 19, a prisoner in enemy hands, facing a court not of peers, but of powerful men determined to break her. The trial, officially for heresy, was in truth a political show, a carefully orchestrated attempt to discredit both Joan and the legitimacy of Charles VII, the king she had helped crown. The court was stacked with pro-English clergy, led by Bishop Pierre Cochon, a man with more loyalty to politics than justice. Joan was denied legal counsel, and the proceedings were conducted entirely in Latin, a language Joan did not understand well. Still, she held her ground with stunning clarity. Time and again, her answers revealed both her intelligence and her deep faith. When asked whether she was in God's grace, a question designed to trap her, she famously replied, "If I am not, may God put me there. And if I am, may God keep me there." It was an answer that silenced even her accusers, and it echoed through history. The charges against her were vague and ever-changing. They accused her of cross-dressing, of claiming divine visions, of blasphemy, anything that might justify condemnation. But everyone in the courtroom, including her enemies, could see that Joan's real crime was her defiance of English power and her unshakable belief that her mission was divine. After months of interrogations, isolation, and threats of torture, Joan eventually signed a document recanting her visions under pressure. But days later, likely realizing what she had been forced to do, she withdrew the recantation. This gave her judges the excuse they needed. She was labeled a relapsed heretic, which under church law carried a death sentence. On May 30th, 1431, Joan was led out into the marketplace of Rouen. She was chained to a tall wooden stake and burned alive. Eyewitnesses said she called out Jesus as the flames rose. Even the English soldiers, hardened by war, were shaken by her composure and courage. Her ashes were thrown into the Seine, as if to erase all trace of her, but her legacy only grew stronger. The girl who had once been mocked for wearing armor and hearing voices was now a martyr, a symbol of resistance, faith, and injustice. Her trial was later declared invalid in a retrial in 1456, and in 1920, nearly 5 centuries later, Joan of Arc was canonized as a saint. Her execution did not silence her story. It immortalized it. Joan of Arc's death in 1431 may have ended her life, but it did not end her influence. In fact, her story only grew more powerful after her execution. Just 25 years later, in 1456, a posthumous retrial was ordered by the very king she had helped to crown, Charles VII. This trial, known as the nullification trial, was held by the church not just to clear her name, but to acknowledge the grave injustice of her original condemnation. Over the course of this new investigation, more than 100 witnesses were called, including soldiers, townspeople, clergy, and those who had once known her personally. Their testimonies painted a very different picture than the one offered by her English-backed accusers. They spoke of her piety, her courage, her discipline, and her unwavering faith. The court concluded that Joan had been wrongfully tried and unjustly executed. Her name was officially cleared on July 7, 1456. The church declared her innocent and her original trial a political sham, but Joan's legacy did not stop with rehabilitation. Over the centuries, she became a figure claimed by many, by monarchists and republicans, Catholics and secularists, feminists and nationalists. Her memory was invoked during times of war, especially when France once again found itself under threat. During World War I, for instance, Joan of Arc became a national symbol of resistance and unity. In 1920, nearly 500 years after her death, Joan was canonized as a saint by the Roman Catholic Church. Pope Benedict XV declared her not only a martyr, but also a model of Christian virtue. Her canonization ceremony drew massive crowds and confirmed her place not just in French history, but in the spiritual imagination of the world. Today, Joan of Arc remains one of France's most beloved historical figures. Statues of her stand in cities across the country. Her story is taught in schools, portrayed in films, operas, and literature, and celebrated annually on May 30th, the date of her death. She is remembered as a brave, visionary young woman who defied societal expectations, challenged kings and priests, and stayed true to her convictions, even unto death. Joan's legacy is more than heroic. It is deeply human, a reminder that even a teenage peasant girl, armed with nothing but faith and resolve, can alter the course of history. The day begins when the rest of the village is still asleep. Long before the rooster crows or the church bell tolls for matins, the baker is already at work. In the dark silence of the early hours, often around midnight, the baker stirs from sleep and lights a fire in the oven. It's a deep stone or brick chamber, sometimes still warm from the day before. Heating it to the right temperature takes time and patience, and this is the first crucial task of the day. While the flames grow and the heat builds, the baker prepares the dough. Using coarse flour milled nearby, water from a public well, a bit of salt, and a precious scoop of sourdough starter saved from yesterday, he begins to knead. There are no machines to ease the burden, just hands, shoulders, and the steady rhythm of pressing and folding. The air is thick with the earthy smell of yeast and sweat. Sometimes an apprentice helps, but often it's solitary, grueling work, physical and repetitive. Once the dough is ready, it's left to rise. The baker may use this brief pause to rest or to fetch more wood for the oven. Soon, loaves are shaped, round, flat, long, depending on local custom. They're slid into the hot oven using long wooden paddles. There's no timer. The baker must judge the heat by instinct and experience, watching the color of the crust and listening to the crackle of fire and bread. By sunrise, the loaves are cooling, and the smell of fresh bread drifts through the village streets. Customers begin to arrive, children sent by mothers, workers on their way to the fields, even monks from the nearby abbey. Some bakers deliver their goods, loading baskets onto a cart or carrying them on foot, making their rounds before the main day begins. In medieval society, bread isn't a luxury. It's survival. For many, it forms the bulk of every meal, especially in poorer homes. That gives bakers a quiet but vital status. They're not nobles or priests, but their work is essential. If a baker falls ill or the oven fails, an entire community feels the lack. They carry a heavy load, not just of dough, but of daily expectation. Though the work is repetitive, even punishing, it's steady. And in a world where famine and scarcity were never far away, that mattered. Each morning, as the sun rises over the thatched roofs and cobbled streets, the baker's warm loaves are proof that life, in all its simplicity and struggle, continues. Step inside a medieval bakery, and you won't find metal mixers or shiny countertops. Instead, the workspace is simple and practical, built entirely around the needs of a single craft, bread making. Every tool has its purpose, and every motion is learned through repetition, passed down from master to apprentice. The heart of the bakery is the brick or stone oven. These ovens are massive, built right into the wall, often with a domed roof and a single opening at the front. There's no temperature gauge, just experience. The baker heats the oven by building a fire directly inside it, letting it burn until the walls absorb enough heat. Then, he rakes out the coals and ashes, cleans the surface, and quickly places the bread inside. The residual heat is what bakes the loaves. It takes a practiced eye to know when it's ready. Some bakers toss a handful of flour onto the hot surface. If it browns too quickly, the oven's still too hot. To handle the loaves, a long wooden peel is used, a flat paddle-like tool with a long handle that lets the baker slide bread in and out without burning himself. There are no gloves or fancy protections, just this simple extension of the arm, worn smooth by daily use. Dough is mixed and kneaded in large wooden troughs or basins. These are heavy and sturdy, often handed down through generations. The baker knows by feel when the dough is right, slightly sticky, elastic, and strong. No measurements, no timers, just touch, smell, and sound. Other small tools might include a curved knife for scoring loaves, or cloths for covering rising dough, a wooden bench for shaping the dough, a bucket for water, maybe a broom for sweeping flour and ash from the floor. That's the extent of the workshop. This was baking by instinct, not instruction manual. Every variable, the weather, the wood, the flour, could change how the bread turned out. But with these few tools and a practiced hand, medieval bakers turned raw ingredients into the one food no village could go without. In medieval Europe, bread wasn't just food. It was a signal of who you were. You could tell someone's social rank just by looking at the kind of bread on their table. From the whitest, finest loaves in noble households to the coarse, dark slabs eaten by peasants, bread reflected not only class but access to resources, purity of ingredients, and even local politics. At the top of the social ladder was manchet bread, a soft white loaf made from finely sifted wheat flour. It required multiple rounds of bolting, a labor-intensive process that removed all the bran and husk. The result was a clean, refined product with a delicate texture. This bread wasn't cheap. Only the wealthy, nobles, clergy, and high-ranking merchants could afford it. Manchet was often served with butter, meat, or wine, and appeared on the tables of banquets and in royal kitchens. Next was ravel or cheat bread, common among the urban middle classes like minor merchants, skilled tradesmen, and some city dwellers. This bread was made from wheat that wasn't as finely sifted, so it had more bran, a denser crumb, and a slightly darker color. It was nutritious and affordable, striking a balance between taste and cost. For many townspeople, this was the daily loaf. Then there was maslin, the bread of the poor. Maslin was made from a mixture of grains, usually rye and wheat, though sometimes barley or oats were added in. The flour was coarse, the taste sour, and the color a dull gray or brown. It was hard to digest, and even harder to enjoy. For peasants and laborers, however, this bread was a lifeline. It was filling, cheap, and lasted longer, even if it was rough on the stomach. Bread types were also regulated by local baking guilds, who set rules for quality, weight, and pricing. Bakers couldn't simply sell whatever they wanted. The assize of bread and ale, a long-standing legal code in England and parts of Europe, dictated how much a loaf should weigh and how much it should cost based on grain prices. Bakers who cheated by using bad flour or selling underweight loaves could be fined or publicly punished, sometimes by being locked in the pillory with their bad bread hung around their neck. Beyond class and commerce, bread played a ritual role too. It was blessed in churches, shared in communal feasts, and offered as alms to the poor. In some villages, certain types of bread were reserved for special holidays or religious festivals. Even funerals and weddings might include specific loaves, rich with symbolism. So in a medieval town, bread wasn't just bread. It was identity. It told you who a person was, what they could afford, and where they fit in the grand order of things. In a world without much social mobility, even a crumb could speak volumes. In the bustling life of a medieval city, bakers weren't free agents. They operated under a tight web of regulations and guild control, designed to ensure fairness, protect consumers, and uphold the reputation of the craft. Baking wasn't just a trade. It was a profession with standards, responsibilities, and serious consequences for cutting corners. The most famous regulation governing baking was the assize of bread and ale, introduced in England in the 13th century, but echoed in many European cities. This law set prices for bread based on the current cost of grain. If wheat became more expensive, the allowed weight of a loaf shrank accordingly, but the price stayed the same. It was a way to stabilize markets and prevent bakers from taking advantage of scarcity. Bakers had to regularly check updated assize tables posted by local officials. Violations were taken seriously. Selling bread that was too light or made with inferior flour was considered a public offense. Punishments could include fines, confiscation of goods, or, most memorably, the pillory. Bakers caught cheating would be locked into a wooden frame in the town square with their bad bread tied around their necks, left for public shame. In some places, they were even dragged around in carts or forced to parade with a loaf on their head as a warning. To become a baker, one had to be part of a guild, a formal organization of craftsmen that regulated membership, training, prices, and competition. A young boy might start as an apprentice under a master baker, living in his home and working for years before becoming a journeyman. Eventually, if he passed the required tests and paid his dues, he could open his own shop and earn the status of master. Guilds also handled disputes, monitored grain supplies, and inspected ovens. If a bakery burned down, a real danger in fire-prone cities, the guild might help rebuild. But if a baker violated rules repeatedly, the guild could expel him, effectively ending his career. These systems weren't just about quality control. They were about public trust. Bread was too essential to everyday life to be left to chance. By regulating every step, from flour delivery to pricing, medieval cities ensured that their citizens had access to one of life's most basic needs. And for bakers, walking that narrow line between craft and compliance was the cost of doing business. Working in a medieval bakehouse wasn't just exhausting, it was dangerous. The environment was hot, crowded, and filled with risks. Bakers faced constant exposure to fire, heavy tools, flour dust, and long hours of repetitive, back-breaking labor. It wasn't a job for the faint of heart. Fire was the biggest threat. Medieval ovens were made of brick or stone and had to be heated by burning wood or peat inside the baking chamber. Once the fire was hot enough, the embers were swept out and the dough was placed directly on the oven floor. But even a small mistake, like an ember left behind or a cloth catching fire, could cause a blaze. Since bakehouses were often located in dense neighborhoods, one fire could easily spread and consume entire streets. In response, many towns eventually created communal bakehouses, larger centralized facilities where several families could bring their dough to be baked. These were often built with thicker stone walls and kept under close watch to reduce the risk of fire. Burns were another constant hazard. Reaching into the deep ovens with long-handled wooden peels, bakers regularly scorched their arms and hands. There were no protective gloves or modern safety gear. If a baker was distracted or slipped on flour-covered floors, a burn could turn serious quickly. And in a time with limited medical care, infection was a real concern. Flour dust created its own problems. Working in small enclosed rooms filled with airborne flour particles could lead to respiratory issues over time. Bakers often inhaled fine dust that irritated their lungs, and some developed chronic coughing or breathing problems. Add to that the physical toll of lifting heavy sacks of flour, kneading dough by hand, and standing for hours near blazing ovens, and you get a picture of a trade that aged its workers fast. Despite the dangers, baking was a vital profession. The risks they faced helped feed entire communities, and while communal bakehouses reduced some individual risk and centralized fire safety, they didn't eliminate the hard labor and constant exposure to heat. Every loaf came at a cost, not just in ingredients, but in sweat, burns, and resilience. Though men dominated the formal guilds and bakehouses, women played a crucial, and often invisible role in medieval baking. In homes across Europe, women were the ones who baked bread for their families. They woke before dawn to knead dough, tend to small ovens, and ensure that there was enough to eat. For many women, baking wasn't just a chore, it was a lifeline. In poorer households, a woman might bake loaves not only for her family, but to sell at market. Street corners, churchyards, and town squares often had stalls or baskets of bread sold by women, sometimes widows, sometimes wives supporting a husband's trade, and sometimes unmarried women surviving on their own labor. These sellers were known in some towns as hucksters, or alewives, if they sold bread with drink, and though they weren't officially recognized by baking guilds, they formed a major part of the urban food economy. In some rare cases, women became guild members, especially if they inherited a bakehouse after their husband's death. A widow could apply for permission to run the shop in her own name, provided she upheld the guild's standards. However, this was never the norm. Most guilds were male-only spaces, and women were only acknowledged when their labor became impossible to ignore. Baking also played a role in women's religious and communal lives. Nuns baked bread in convents for both daily use and charity. Women in village festivals often prepared special loaves for holidays or rituals, linking their domestic skills with the spiritual calendar. Despite being central to the process that fed cities and villages, women's work in baking was largely unrecorded, passed from mother to daughter, learned through experience, and left out of official records. Still, without their hands at the dough, medieval communities would have been hungrier, and their food culture far less rich. By acknowledging their contribution, we begin to see the fuller picture, that baking in the Middle Ages was not only a professional trade, but also a deeply gendered labor woven into the fabric of everyday survival. In the medieval world, baking wasn't just a man's trade. Behind the scenes, in homes, on street corners, and sometimes even in bakehouses, women played an essential role in keeping society fed. Their contributions often went unrecorded, but they were absolutely central to the daily rhythm of life. At the household level, baking was a woman's task. In cottages and kitchens across towns and villages, women rose early to prepare dough for their families. They measured flour by feel, stirred water by instinct, and managed small hearth ovens with care. Many used sourdough starters passed down through generations. For rural and poor urban families, this home-baked bread wasn't just a tradition, it was survival. But women weren't limited to their homes. Many stepped into the local economy as market sellers, offering extra loaves for sale in town squares and at church gates. These women were known by different names, hucksters, regraders, or vendors, and while they weren't part of official bakers' guilds, they were often the most accessible bread sellers for the common people. They operated without shops or signs, often selling from baskets or stalls. For many widows or single mothers, it was a crucial income source. In rare cases, women entered the formal baking trade. If a baker died, his wife might inherit the shop and apply to keep it running. Some guilds allowed this, provided she upheld their standards, A few women even became master bakers in their own right, though they were exceptions in a male-dominated system. Women's economic contribution to baking was often informal, but deeply impactful. They supported families, fed neighborhoods, and kept communities nourished. Yet historical records seldom mention them. Their names are largely lost, but their labor is woven into every loaf that came from a home hearth or a street vendor's basket. By recognizing women in baking, we don't just expand our understanding of the trade, we restore a missing half of the story. Without their skill and effort, the bread economy of the Middle Ages would have looked very different. Bread in medieval Europe wasn't just food, it was sacred. Nowhere was this more evident than in the heart of the medieval church, where bread took on profound religious meaning. The most obvious example is the Eucharist, the central rite of Christian worship. In this ritual, bread, often simple, unleavened wafers, symbolized the body of Christ. It was blessed, elevated, and consumed by priests and laypeople alike. The act wasn't symbolic alone. Many believe the bread became Christ's literal body through transubstantiation. That belief gave bread a spiritual power far beyond the bakery. Churches and monasteries were often major centers of baking. Monks and nuns oversaw well-equipped kitchens where bread was made for daily meals, for the poor, and for religious ceremonies. These monastic bakehouses produced bread in large quantities, not just for their own use, but as part of their charitable missions. Distributing loaves to the hungry was seen as an act of piety, and many monasteries became known for their regular bread handouts. Special loaves were also baked for holy days and festivals. On feast days, churches might distribute sweetened or decorated bread, known as holy bread, or blessed loaves. These could be symbolic, braided for unity, spiced for celebration, and were sometimes given to children or the elderly. Certain saints' days had traditional bread recipes, and in some regions, people brought their own loaves to be blessed by priests. Bread even influenced church architecture. Some churches had dedicated spaces for bread distribution, and a few even had stone carvings or stained glass depicting bakers and loaves, a quiet nod to the trade's sacred role. In every sense, bread connected the physical and the spiritual. It nourished the body, and through ritual, the soul. In the medieval mindset, baking wasn't just a job. In the right context, it was a form of worship. In the medieval world, bread wasn't just food, it was power. It lay at the heart of both daily survival and political stability. When bread was plentiful and affordable, rulers slept easier. When it wasn't, riots erupted, and thrones trembled. For medieval authorities, managing bread meant managing people. Governments understood this. That's why they imposed strict price controls on bread, especially in cities. The most famous of these was the English Assize of Bread and Ale, a set of regulations dating back to the 13th century. It didn't just set prices, it linked the price of bread directly to the cost of grain. If flour prices rose, bread could be a bit smaller, but had to stay affordable. If a baker cheated, by shortchanging weight or raising prices, they faced harsh punishments, like public humiliation in the pillory or hefty fines. These laws weren't just about fairness, they were about avoiding social unrest. Bread was the staple food for most of the population. When it became scarce or unaffordable, people didn't just go hungry, they grew angry. Urban riots often began at bakeries. A missing loaf could lead to a broken window, and then to full-scale protest. Rulers knew this pattern well. In times of famine or poor harvests, they sometimes released emergency grain stores or organized charity bread distributions, not purely out of compassion, but to preserve order. Even religious and noble elites participated in this delicate balance. Some monasteries and lords made a point of giving bread to the poor during holy days or times of hardship. This wasn't just piety. It was a form of soft power, a way to show moral leadership and prevent rebellion. In artwork and sermons, bread often symbolized justice and care, or the lack of it. A good ruler was one who ensured his people were fed. A bad one let them starve while feasting in his hall. Bread was a measure of a ruler's soul. So while bakers kneaded dough in the early hours of the morning, they were doing more than preparing meals. They were upholding a fragile social contract where every loaf helped keep hunger and rebellion at bay. The legacy of medieval bakers lingers not only in warm loaves and rustic ovens, but in the very fabric of language and tradition that surrounds how we eat and relate to each other. These early artisans helped shape not just the food culture of their time, but also the structure and spirit of the communities they served, and many of those traces remain with us today. One of the most beautiful examples of this legacy is found in the word companion. It comes from the Latin com, with, and panis, bread. A companion was literally someone you shared bread with. That simple image, two people breaking bread together, speaks volumes about how central bakers and their craft were to daily life and social connection. In a world where many went to bed hungry, the act of sharing bread was deeply meaningful. Beyond language, guild traditions started by medieval bakers laid the foundation for many professional standards we still follow. Medieval baking guilds weren't just about price control. They enforced training, protected trade secrets, and upheld quality. An apprentice would spend years under a master baker, learning to recognize when dough had risen just enough or when the oven was perfectly hot without using a thermometer. These standards passed down not only skills, but pride in craftsmanship, a legacy echoed in today's artisan bread movements. Even modern customs like special breads on holidays, from Christmas loaves to hot cross buns, have roots in medieval baking rituals. These traditions gave meaning to the seasons, connected the sacred with the everyday, and provided a sense of comfort and continuity. So while the tools have changed and the ovens are hotter, the heart of medieval baking, community, care, and craft, is still very much alive today. As we close our quiet journey through forgotten alleys, herb-scented hearths, and flour-dusted ovens, take a moment to breathe. History is full of ordinary lives quietly shaping the world. If this helped you relax or drift a little, feel free to like the video, subscribe for more slow history, and share where you're listening from. Sleep well, and thank you for spending your time here with us.